Messer Radio Hour, a 30-minute podcast in which I skim books and interview people. We have a great guest we're going to talk to in a second. Before we get there, the book I'm skimming is The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and in Business. I like this book because there are a lot of self-helpy type books that focus on goals. You know, where do you want to be at the end of the year? Where do you want to be in 5 years, in a lifetime? This book says, what are your habits? Because he says, if your habits don't produce the goal that you want, the goal doesn't matter. So if your goal is to run a marathon, but your habits are eating Cheetos and Fritos for breakfast, the goal won't happen no matter what, right? So you really have to focus on your habits. And I've been really struck in quarantine by just how set in stone habits can become really easily. You know, you get into a certain routine, a certain liturgy throughout the day, and that kind of defines your day. You know, there are certain things you do. Scenery isn't changing in quarantine. So those habits really regulate your life more than scenery or change of spaces. So one of the good insights of the book is that you have to trade out one habit for another. So it's not like you have no habits and then you start habits. Instead, we already have habits. We already have rituals throughout the day. And you have to trade out one habit for another. So he points to the success of a program like Alcoholics Anonymous. And he says Alcoholics Anonymous is so powerful because it recognizes that every habit has at the beginning a cue and at the end a reward. So you have a cue, like say to drink. You have a cue, which is sadness or elation, whatever it is. You have the habit of drinking, and then you have the reward of, you know, the stimuli that alcohol gives you. Alcoholics Anonymous comes in, and it doesn't just give you a goal, stop drinking. It gives you a habit, a process, a system that you can embody and indwell. And that habit replaces the other and gives you your goal to stop drinking. But that goal is accomplished through a habit. So I just found it to be a really helpful, powerful book, specifically, if you're a believer, as you think about spiritual formation. Your goal can be, a deeper and deeper communion with Christ through the Spirit. But if your habits, if you're habitually living a life that isn't producing that union and communion, then you really have to examine not just your goals. We can have all of the goals in the world, but you have to say, what habits do I have? Habits of, looking into a screen, habits of, obsessively online shopping, whatever it is, and think, what are those habits producing in me? And is that a good fruit or a bad fruit? If it's a bad fruit, we have to think about indwelling, embodying a new habit, a new practice. So that is the book I'm skimming this week. The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and in Business. It was so much fun. I recorded this a couple of days ago to talk with my good friend, Dave Larlee. Hope you enjoy that conversation. Our guest today is Dave Larlee and company. Dave is the vicar of All Saints Church, Dallas, and from Canada originally. And every time I talk to Dave, I feel like it's entertaining enough to be a podcast. So this is going to be the easiest podcast ever. Dave, how are you?
Dustin, I'm well. Forgive the distraction here. We've just safely navigated 2 Zoom calls and FaceTime reading with grandparents. So as a Luddite, I'm being pushed to new depths of what I need to know how to master.
And all the grandparents live in different countries than this one.
That's right. We got 2.
Yeah, tell us where they're at.
We've got 2 in Canada and 1 in England.
So England, let's start there. You moved from Canada to study at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford. And then how long did you serve in the Church of England?
Yeah, so I arrived 2001 and I was ordained in 2003. And so, golly, it was about 10 years I served. And we were in an inner city context in the main streets of London for 10 years and then left that for Dallas.
Okay, so here's what I'm going to ask you. I just talked to a friend yesterday who told me he had the Easter blues. And I bet you could guess my response, because my response was, you don't have to have the post-Easter blues yet. We are still in the season of Easter. So tell us what Easter is. I'm sure a lot of people, most people listening to this know, but maybe some don't. What's Easter?
Yeah, so Easter is not just a day, but a season. And certainly in our world, Easter lasts for 40 days. And so it's kind of the Control Z of Lent, if you imagine, the great undo, where in Lent you have this penitent time where you contemplate all the difficulty and the things that aren't quite right with the world. And then we have the other side of it, 40 days of celebrating all that Jesus done for it. So for us. And it's an interesting time because in some churches, it's the 40 days where you don't confess your sin because you're celebrating the glory of the resurrection. And, it's one of those things similar to the pandemic season we're in, where we can't gather. Everybody's acutely aware. Even your deepest, darkest introverts are aware of how nice it is to be around people. And because we can't, when we finally are able to meet together, we'll enjoy it so much more. So in the same way, it's the flip side of that. So in Lent, we contemplate, the problem of sin, the brokenness of the world. And then at Easter, in the Easter season, these 40 days, we celebrate just all that Jesus done to overcome those things.
Yeah. So I have friends, and I know you do too, who they totally believe everything we say happened that we remember during Holy Week before the resurrection. They think there was a guy named Jesus. They think he died on the cross, or let's say this. They think that there was a historical figure named Jesus who went to the cross. Some say maybe he didn't die and then came out, and that explains it. But I have a lot of friends who would say, but the resurrection part, the Easter part, Lent, okay, we buy that happened. But the resurrection, they are super doubtful of. Do you have friends like that who doubt that Jesus rose from the dead?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I love hearing their ideas of what actually may have happened, and instead of the resurrection, because it is kind of a moment where all of Christianity hangs on this one thing that did Jesus actually rise from the dead?
That's the most, yeah. Did Jesus rise from the dead? So I want to ask you about that. But before I do, one thing you and I have in common, one of the things you and I have in common, a love for poutine would be one of them. But the second would be a love for classic cinema.
Yes.
You and I were just talking about one of the all-time greats that belongs in a vault somewhere of classic cinema, Weekend at Bernie's.
Oh.
So this, in some ways, would be a theory of what happened to Jesus, right?
Yes. In fact, I wonder if the author of the screenplay actually had in mind the events of Easter and the road, of Holy Week as a way to kind of explain what it might have looked like if things had gone a different way.
In other words, maybe Jesus died on the cross, the disciples super eager to, prove that he was who he said he was, and that the temple was rebuilt after 3 days, and that you have John and Peter on either side of Jesus snatching the body and just sort of parading.
Yeah. Because that's the thing with the Easter season is in the first 40 days after we claim he died and rose again, he began to appear everywhere. And if you obviously all these different illustrations break down up to a point, and you can tip into heresy pretty gloriously, which we may do. So this is kind of a work in progress from my point of view. I'm still thinking this through, but if you compare the premise of Weekend at Bernie's and some of these theories of what may have happened had Jesus not, as we say, risen from the dead, there are some pretty strong parallels.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And I would just say, if someone's taking bets, there's a graph of the Bermuda Triangle behind you, the odds that we're going
Yeah.
to slip into heresy are more likely than not based on that. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I remember when I was in college, a guy, he may have been at Wycliffe Hall, I can't remember, Richard Bauckham. Do you know Richard Bauckham?
Uh-huh.
He came,
Not personally.
yeah, he came and gave some lectures at during my undergrad years, and he was the first person I heard say, Jesus rising from the dead. He said, I am a Christian. I'm a believer. He said, but I believe it for not really churchy reasons. I think it actually happened. And he kind of did point to a Weekend at Bernie's thing that was like, what's more believable? That all of these people see, a dead guy just walking around, being carried around Weekend at Bernie style, or that they hallucinated or whatever. And he sort of goes through these things. And then he says, as a historian, I have to say that there was a man who died on a cross. A bunch of people saw it. And then that same man is walking around later. And he said, how you figure that out is one thing. He said, but I believe that that man who died on a cross came and met his friends as a historical matter. And so thinking about it like Weekend at Bernie style is really helpful, because the whole thing about the movie is this would be a silly thing, Ultimately, they can't pull it off. Or I guess how many Weekend at Bernie's are there? 2, 3?
I stopped counting after 3. It's kind of like that other classic that's strangely overlooked by the Academy, Sharknado. People have just stopped counting how many they've made.
So good. I think this is true, that the president, Donald Trump, this isn't a joke, this was serious, was cast to be the president in that movie, Sharknado, but then decided to run for president. And it was on the fence. So I think I forget who they got to play the president, someone else.
And that's probably a topic for another show, because, there's a whole other direction we go here, whether Sharknado is actually a prophetic piece for our time.
It has to. We'll just assume it is, and we'll circle.
Question mark discuss.
Question mark discuss. So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Resurrection, you say the pinnacle of our faith. If you're explaining, someone comes in and probably most people, you talk to and I talk to, they're not really asking that. They're asking questions like, I have this deep wound.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to help me? Most people come to stuff existentially like that. But some people you talk to, they just want to know, is this stuff we believe true? Like, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? I mean, they have wounds also that need healing. But the thing they're looking for in that moment is it true? So what would you say to that person? They come in, they say, you're celebrating Easter. That's fine and well. Maybe it's giving you guys some help, but do you think it's true?
Yeah, I think that is really where a huge dividing line, because like so many people are asking the objective question.
Yeah.
Is it true? Does the logic line up? Show me the evidence. Da, da, da. But really, when it comes down to it, after you kind of address that, you're ended up with the subjective, right?
Yeah.
They say, truth, and I think this is whether it's postmodern or, it's really what I find a lot of my friends in the 20s are asking, which is, if it's true, show me how it's real to me, right? How does it apply to my everyday life and make a difference? And if you think about it, what you see in Jesus is you see someone who was known as someone who had wild parties. And he had all the wrong people there, right? I mean, the religious elite were upset because he was hanging out with the people on the margins of society, and he wasn't really trying to get the elites onto their side. And what we see is, when you distill everything down to the life of Jesus, there's something incredibly that it just draws you in. And I think this is the challenge of any religious establishment, is how do we keep in touch with the Jesus portrayed in the Gospels? And I just think that there's an incredible thing there. So what I say is I'll answer the questions, and a lot of questions these days I don't necessarily have the answer to. And it's not so much that I don't know it, it's just that the questions I find that people have today
Yeah.
may not have been the questions that I was asking when I was exploring faith, all that stuff. And so I'm really happy to just say, wait, well, I don't necessarily know your answer right now, but we can find it out and let's talk. And I find that the conversation to me seems to be as important as giving the answer.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this could be the well of Weekend at Bernie's is so deep, because here's another way we could draw on it is historically, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense that this Jesus guy is just propped up, and paraded around town and people are tricked. It seems like he really rose from the dead. But if it's true that he rose from the dead, it's not like he lived 30 more years and then died. He's still alive.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, the reason they left faith is they carried Jesus around. They never had an experience with the resurrected Christ in the Holy Spirit. And it's just like they're carrying around a dead man, and they're trying to convince themselves, no, this is real, he's alive. And it's exhausting. And the truth is, the resurrected Christ, if he really did rise from the dead 2,000 years ago, he's alive now. And if that's true, all the other stuff in the Gospels is true. And the other stuff in the Gospels is he loves us. He wants to know you. And so you can kind of back into it to say, okay, you have these intellectual questions. That's good. But if you experience him, like if he's actually alive, you're not having to just prop him up on your shoulder. But if you can actually lean on his shoulder because he's alive, if you can have an encounter with the Spirit, if you can know God, all of the other intellectual stuff on the back end kind of gets lined up, because if he's alive now, it only follows that he became alive 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Any other any other Weekend at Bernie's plot points you want to connect with the gospel?
Yeah. Well, I just think, what I love about obviously the hilarity of Weekend at Bernie's is you've got a guy who parties every weekend in the Hamptons. Is it the Hamptons or it's?
I think so.
Yeah, and he invites these two guys who aren't very clever. I mean, one's clever and one is clearly not. And just trying to see the effort they go to try to keep the ruse going that Bernie is still alive. And, everybody buys into it because they know him by reputation. But, they're classic moments where they have to make the body disappear and he's on a lawn chair and they just kind of throw him over the side of the veranda. And then this little girl happens to be there. And what does she do? She begins to bury the body, right? Bury the evidence. Or maybe it's a boy. I can't remember now. Or there's the moment where Bernie goes water skiing. And, if you haven't seen it, it's good. It's definitely a PG-13, probably on the R side of things, but it is hilarious. But you just see that in order to make it palatable, that they manufactured this thing that he's still alive, it takes incredibly brilliant people, which Weekend at Bernie's does not have. And it also requires a pretty convincing narrative, which, although Weekend at Bernie's is gloriously entertaining, the narrative isn't that strong. I mean, the premise is a guy dies and they keep him awake, but you see the frustration of the hitman who keeps trying to kill Bernie, and you just can't believe this guy's coming. And actually, it's kind of compelling. So that's it.
That's it. What an understatement that is. Weekend at Bernie's, we can keep drawing from it for years and years to come. The last thing I wanted to ask you is, I don't know that I've ever asked you this question directly. I've heard stories that kind of make sense. You are Canadian originally. You moved to England, and now you live in Dallas, Texas. Canada, London, Dallas are very different places. What is the difference between ministry in London versus ministry in Dallas? I'm sure there's a lot of similarities, but how have you navigated that, being a minister in London versus Dallas?
I think a lot of it has come down to availability. We were talking just the other day, the lot in the culture, certainly in London, it felt with where, I mean, it's a mega city. You've got a lot going on, and our existence was in a very small zip code, right? SW11. And I think part of it was just being available. And so what I mean by that is, you said in a previous podcast, people would come up and make arrangements and for when they died. And certainly we were the church. Anybody who died in our zip code, we did the funeral. And just being available to people and walking down the street. And the ministry in Dallas, in London, was much more pedestrian in that we walked everywhere. Right. So people got to know you, they got to see you. And even though they didn't really have a conversation, they kind of knew who you were, right? You're the vicar. Whereas Dallas, you don't walk anywhere, certainly in the summer, right? So the availability thing is makes it a bit of a challenge. But also, you found that if you were willing to be available to people and just sit and listen and pray and stop and just kind of engage with them a little bit, they remembered that a lot more. So, my sermons, I think, are sheer brilliance, but they actually aren't. I mean, the thing is, if you try to be the best preacher, there's always someone's going to come along. I mean, our friend Tim being one of them, he's just, Tim Keller's just a rock star, right? And yet, when I returned, I was there a year ago, and I saw a lot of the same people I'd gotten to know over a decade. They didn't remember a sermon I preached, but they remembered I was there.
Yeah.
And they remembered that I had visited them when something had happened, or had stopped in, or I remembered their names of the children. And I think so much of ministry is about being a faithful presence, right?
Yeah.
And so in Dallas, man, there's so many people have so many theological degrees that have a lot more letters attached to them than mine. And people are really intelligent and they know a lot. And I love them, right? Because it means I don't have to know all that stuff. And at first I was intimidated moving into Dallas because of all of that. And then I realized, no, there is a place for me, as that, I'm just a priest, I'm just a generalist, but there is a real place for people just to be available and to sit and to be good at, a number of things and expert in none, right? Because we have people like you who are the experts, right?
Well,
and that idea of just being present, to me, that's been the key. If there's anything I've learned, is how are we present and available? And a lot of the stories that I could tell are simply because of that, of my attempt to be available and present to people.
And it's funny because before I got to know you well, I heard we met. First of all, we should say the very first time I met you, I don't know if you remember this, but I came to an Alpha retreat, and so I heard you talk about all of these times you just were, walking down the street and met someone and they became believers, all these crazy stories. And I never doubted that they happened, but I was always just like, how could that many things happen to you? And then anybody who's ever been to breakfast with you or walked to get coffee with you, you really are present in the sense of, one time we were having breakfast and you always wear your collar, and a police officer came up, and much like the board behind you with conspiracy theories, he just sort of started sharing his conspiracy theories. And he told us about
that was crazy.
Yeah, he told us about his YouTube channel. The other day, we got coffee, and the barista was asking for dating advice. And that's one of the things I've really learned from you, is that, Dallas has a very sort of Bible-y subculture, but at the end of the day, there are all these people walking around, and they may just have a ton of head knowledge, but everybody has this deep, loneliness or wound. And I always think of the word vicar. You're doing something. Jesus is doing something vicariously through you. Just that presence, being near people, they really are longing for and hungering for something deeper than just head knowledge or just what the subculture that the Dallas is kind of known for. Has. That's one of the things I've really learned from you is once you're present and you sit, initially what people talk about, maybe superficial, but once that gets out of the way, there's another conversation behind that initial conversation where the real work of the Spirit happens, where the resurrected Christ meets the person and knows the person and names the person. Dave, any other closing thoughts for us, word for us in this Easter season?
You know, I'm just in awe of you, Dustin, and you don't know this because you've not been part of the 35 days of homeschooling regime here that we're going through.
Yeah.
But your how-to guide on how to build the perfect trail mix is a thing of legend. And non-edible raisins.
Yeah.
Is that what it's called?
NRE, non-raisin.
It's really had a lasting impact. In fact, the boys, it's really upped our snack game, and it's put a lot of pressure on us, but it's moved us towards excellence.
The key is you can always take the raisins out later if you add too many. So just start off with more than you think you want. And then later you can always pick out a few extra, but you just start off stronger than you think you'll need, and you'll never regret it. In my opinion, that's my experience.
That's a great rule that you could take into most aspects of life, right? Just start strong and then wean yourself off.
Yeah, you can always back up later. Dave Larlee is the vicar of All Saints Dallas, and someone I'm very happy and proud to call a friend. Dave, thank you for doing this.
This is a pleasure. I've got to get back to the Bermuda Triangle here. So
of course, once you figure it out,
let us know. Every blessing. Bye.
My thanks to Dave Larlee for that stimulating conversation. My thanks to you for listening. This is your weekly reminder to keep talking to people and reading books.